The June heat hung heavy in the air as Sophie Manning gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. Her heart raced, not from the weather but from the glowing dot on her phone screen. It pulsed, mocking her, revealing the location of her husband, Richard. He wasn't at his office in Greenville. He wasn't at a client meeting, as he had claimed. No, he was at a seedy motel on the outskirts of Spartanburg, a place Richard Manning, the charming, polished financial executive, had no business being. Sophie's thoughts spiraled. She had always dismissed her growing suspicions as paranoia, chalking up Richard's late nights and cryptic phone calls to work stress. But this was undeniable. The tracking app she had reluctantly installed weeks ago now confirmed her worst fears. He was hiding something. Or someone. The motel loomed ahead, its neon sign flickering, vacancy, in the fading daylight. Sophie parked a safe distance away, her breath shallow as she scanned the lot. And then she saw it, Richard's car, unmistakable with its glossy black paint and personalized plates. Her stomach churned. Before she could steel herself to confront him, another car pulled into the lot, an old, battered Honda. Sophie's chest tightened as she recognized it immediately, Chloe's car. Her daughter's car. Her mind reeled, refusing to process what her eyes were witnessing. Chloe, her bright, beautiful 18-year-old daughter, stepped out, her movements hurried but purposeful. She clutched her phone tightly, her eyes darting around nervously before heading toward a room at the far end of the motel. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the door opened, and Richard appeared. His tall frame blocked the view momentarily, but the smile on his face, a mix of relief and something else, something darker, was unmistakable. He ushered Chloe inside, the door closing behind them. For a moment, the world tilted on its axis. Sophie sat frozen in her car, the pieces of her seemingly perfect life crumbling around her. The man she had married, the man she had trusted to be a father to her child, was now standing behind that door. With Chloe. Seconds stretched into minutes. Sophie's hand hovered over the door handle of her car, trembling with indecision. Did she truly want to know? Could she bear the weight of the betrayal her instinct screamed was unfolding inside that room? She could still turn back, pretend she had seen nothing, preserve the fragile facade of her family. But then a sound pierced through her haze of denial. Laughter. Light and carefree, it seeped through the motel's thin walls, Chloe's musical giggle, followed by Richard's deep chuckle. The intimacy in their shared joy was a knife twisting in Sophie's chest. With a deep breath, she pushed open her car door and stepped out. The asphalt was hot beneath her shoes, and her legs felt weak, but she moved forward, propelled by a mix of fury and desperation. Reaching the door, she raised her hand to knock. For a moment, she hesitated, her fist trembling mid-air. From inside, the laughter stopped, replaced by hushed whispers. She knocked again, louder this time, her voice breaking as she called, "Richard? Chloe?" The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching out like a chasm she could never cross. But then the door creaked open, revealing Richard, his hair disheveled, his shirt hastily buttoned. Behind him, Chloe stood, her face pale, her eyes wide with guilt and fear. In that instant, Sophie's world shattered. The carefully crafted image of her family, the years of sacrifice and trust, it all crumbled like ash in the wind. What lay behind that door was more than betrayal, it was an abyss she could never escape. The first time Sophie met Richard Manning, she thought he was the answer to her prayers. It was the spring of 2014, and the city of Asheville buzzed with life, its historic charm alive with the hum of an annual charity gala. Sophie had reluctantly attended, coaxed by a friend who insisted she needed a night out. At 30, she was a divorced single mother, her world centered entirely on her then 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. The idea of mingling with Asheville's elite was more daunting than exciting. But Richard changed all that. He approached her with a confidence that could only belong to someone who had mastered every room he entered. Tall, with sharp features softened by a warm smile, he extended his hand, introducing himself as a financial executive with ambitions of growing his firm's presence in the Carolinas. His charm wasn't overwhelming but deliberate, and Sophie found herself lowering her guard. By the end of the evening, they had exchanged numbers, and within days, Richard was calling her regularly, their conversation stretching late into the night. Their romance was a whirlwind. Richard courted her with an intensity that was equal parts thrilling and disarming. Lavish dinners, weekend getaways to Charleston, and quiet moments where he listened intently to her dreams and fears, all of it felt too good to be true. For Sophie, who had spent years trapped in a loveless first marriage, Richard seemed like a man who could offer both stability and excitement. For Richard, Sophie was everything he sought, poised, intelligent, and, most importantly, unattached except for Chloe. She fit perfectly into the image of the life he was building. By the fall of 2014, Richard proposed, presenting Sophie with a dazzling diamond ring during a candlelit dinner. It was the kind of proposal that seemed ripped from a romance novel, complete with applause from other diners. Sophie hesitated for only a moment before saying yes, believing she was giving herself and Chloe a second chance at happiness. Their wedding in December was a spectacle, held at a sprawling estate in Greenville, South Carolina. Chloe, dressed in a pale pink dress, served as the flower girl, her innocent delight drawing smiles from the guests. "We're a family now," Sophie had whispered to her daughter that day. And for a while, it felt true. The first few years of their marriage seemed idyllic. Richard's career soared as he expanded his firm, spending long hours at the office and traveling frequently to secure high-profile clients. Sophie embraced her role as the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties for Richard's colleagues and clients. Chloe thrived in Greenville's prestigious schools, her bubbly personality and academic success a source of pride for both Sophie and Richard. But as Richard's career flourished, Sophie began to notice the distance creeping into their relationship. The late nights at the office turned into missed dinners, and the business trips became longer. At first, Sophie told herself it was temporary, the price of ambition. But as the years passed, the moments of intimacy they had once shared grew fewer and far between. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, were reduced to logistical discussions about Chloe's school schedule or the next charity event Sophie was planning. Sophie tried to reignite the spark. She planned romantic getaways, cooked elaborate meals, and even revived her interest in yoga and fitness, hoping to capture the attention of the man she once knew. But Richard remained distant, his mind consumed by spreadsheets and the constant demands of his career. When she suggested couples counseling, he brushed it off with a reassuring smile. "We're fine, Sophie. Every marriage goes through phases." By 2018, the phases had become their new normal. They slept in separate bedrooms, citing Richard's snoring as the reason, a convenient excuse they both offered to curious friends. Their interactions were cordial but cold, more like business partners than a married couple. Sophie threw herself into her role as Chloe's mother, attending every recital, every game, and volunteering at school functions. Chloe became the center of Sophie's world, the one bright spot in an otherwise empty house. While Sophie was busy managing the household and Chloe's blossoming adolescence, Richard buried himself deeper into work. His career, now his singular focus, provided him with an escape from the realities of his failing marriage. He became the quintessential professional, sharp, ambitious, and always on the move. To the outside world, the Mannings seemed untouchable, the perfect couple with an equally perfect child. But inside their sprawling Greenville home, the silence was deafening. Richard's frequent absences extended beyond work. He began staying out late under the guise of networking events, his explanations vague and unconvincing. Sophie, desperate to keep the family intact, chose not to confront him. The alternative, divorce, was unthinkable. Not because of love, but because of what it would mean for Chloe. Sophie couldn't bear the thought of uprooting her daughter's life again or the whispers from their tight-knit community. Instead, she clung to the image of their family, meticulously maintaining it for the world to see. She dressed impeccably for their rare public appearances together, played the doting wife at social events, and avoided conversations that might trigger an argument. But inside, Sophie felt the growing weight of loneliness, her heart heavy with the realization that the life she had rebuilt was crumbling beneath her. In the absence of love from her husband, Sophie turned to Chloe, channeling all her energy into ensuring her daughter had everything she needed. From expensive summer camps to private tutors, Sophie spared no expense to give Chloe the best. Their relationship, while close, was not without tension. Sophie's tendency to overprotect and live vicariously through Chloe's achievements often led to arguments. But beneath it all, Chloe adored her mother, even as she struggled with the pressures Sophie unknowingly placed on her. For Richard, Chloe was an afterthought. He attended her events out of obligation, not genuine interest, further isolating himself from the family dynamic. But as Chloe grew older, something shifted. By the time she entered her senior year of high school, the dynamics in the Manning household were about to change in ways no one could have foreseen. And Sophie, blind to the storm brewing within her own home, clung to the illusion that everything could still be saved. By the time Chloe Manning entered her senior year of high school in the fall of 2022, the cracks in the family dynamic had grown into visible fissures. What once was a picture-perfect family had settled into a routine of polite detachment. Sophie clung to the belief that this was just a phase, a low point in marriage that would eventually resolve itself. But beneath the surface, a dangerous undercurrent was beginning to shift, one that would forever change the course of their lives. At 18, Chloe was no longer the precocious little girl who had once been the glue holding the Mannings together. She had grown into a striking young woman, with a magnetic charm that drew people in effortlessly. Her achievements in academics, athletics, and social circles only heightened her appeal. Teachers praised her intellect, classmates admired her confidence, and Sophie reveled in the reflected glow of her daughter's success. But with Chloe's blossoming independence came subtle changes. She spent more time away from home, balancing school, extracurricular activities, and outings with friends. Her relationship with Sophie, once inseparable, began to show strains. Sophie's tendency to micromanage Chloe's life, from her college applications to her friendships, led to frequent arguments. Chloe, eager to carve out her own identity, pushed back, testing the boundaries of her mother's overbearing love. For Richard, Chloe's transformation was impossible to ignore. Once an afterthought in his busy world, she now occupied a larger space in his consciousness. Her laughter, her sharp wit, and the way she carried herself with the same grace Sophie once had, it all caught his attention in a way he hadn't expected. It began innocuously enough. Richard, feeling the weight of his upcoming 50th birthday, started showing an unusual interest in Chloe's life. He began attending her volleyball games and school events, sitting in the stands with Sophie, who was initially delighted by his newfound involvement. He offered to help Chloe with her college applications, using his professional expertise to guide her choices. For the first time in years, Richard seemed present, part of the family rather than a distant figure retreating into work. Sophie, desperate for any sign of reconciliation, encouraged their bonding. She hoped it might bridge the growing gulf between her and Richard, reigniting the sense of partnership they had once shared. For a while, it seemed to work. Family dinners felt less strained, and the house seemed warmer with Richard's laughter mingling with Chloe's. But as the weeks turned into months, Sophie began to notice subtle shifts that unsettled her. Richard's attention toward Chloe felt different. It wasn't just paternal pride or interest. There was an intensity to the way he looked at her, a softness in his tone that Sophie couldn't quite place. At first, she dismissed it, brushing off her unease as overthinking. But the little things began to pile up. Richard's conversations with Chloe were animated and lively in a way his exchanges with Sophie no longer were. When Sophie entered the room, they would abruptly stop talking, their laughter dying mid-sentence. Chloe, too, began to change. She dressed more carefully, seeking Richard's compliments. She lingered at the dinner table, asking for his advice on everything from career paths to social dilemmas. Sophie chalked it up to Chloe seeking validation from a father figure, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind warned her otherwise. The once harmonious atmosphere of the Manning household grew increasingly tense. Sophie often found herself feeling like an outsider in her own family. She would watch as Chloe and Richard shared inside jokes, their eyes meeting across the table in ways that made her feel excluded. When Sophie tried to insert herself into their conversations, they would politely indulge her before quickly resuming their private rapport. Chloe, for her part, was caught in a web of conflicting emotions. Richard's attention made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. With Sophie's constant pressure and high expectations weighing on her, Richard's warmth and validation felt like a refuge. But as her admiration for him deepened, so did her confusion. Was this what having a father figure felt like? Or was it something more? Richard, meanwhile, began to rationalize his growing feelings. He told himself that his renewed interest in Chloe was natural, a byproduct of wanting to connect with his family after years of emotional distance. But the truth was far darker. He was drawn to her vibrancy, her youth, and the way she reminded him of a version of Sophie he believed had long since disappeared. The guilt gnawed at him, but he buried it deep, justifying his actions as harmless. As the holidays approached, Sophie's unease became impossible to ignore. One night, she walked into the living room to find Chloe and Richard sitting too close on the couch, their heads bent together over her laptop. They sprang apart when they noticed her, Chloe's cheeks flushed, Richard offering a strained smile. Sophie didn't say anything, but the image lingered in her mind. Another time, during a neighborhood gathering, Sophie overheard a friend comment on how Richard and Chloe seemed so close these days. The remark was innocent, but it sent a chill down Sophie's spine. She laughed it off in the moment, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. By early 2023, the tension in the Manning household was palpable. Family dinners became a minefield of loaded glances and unspoken words. Sophie found herself increasingly isolated, torn between confronting her growing suspicions and maintaining the fragile facade of their family. Chloe and Richard, unaware of the storm brewing, continued to orbit closer to each other, their connection deepening with every passing day. It was a house on the brink, each member walking a fine line between denial and discovery. None of them could predict how quickly the illusion of their lives would shatter, or the devastating consequences that would follow. It was a rainy night in March 2023, the kind of night that cloaks the world in shadows and drowns whispers in the steady drumbeat of falling rain. Sophie Manning was out of town, attending a charity gala in Charlotte, leaving Richard and Chloe alone in the house. The storm outside mirrored the tension brewing within the Manning home, unspoken, unacknowledged, but undeniably present. Chloe had spent the evening sprawled on the couch, flipping through college brochures with a furrowed brow. The weight of her impending graduation and the whirlwind of decisions about her future had left her feeling overwhelmed. When Richard returned home early from the office, he found her there, the soft glow of the living room lamps highlighting the frustration etched across her face. "You look like you could use a break," Richard said, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie. He poured himself a glass of wine, hesitated, then poured a second. "Come on, just one. You're practically an adult now." Chloe hesitated before accepting the glass. She wasn't a heavy drinker, but the allure of sharing a moment of camaraderie with Richard was too tempting to resist. It felt different from the usual family interactions, less formal, more intimate. As the wine flowed and the rain hammered against the windows, the conversation turned from casual to confessional. "You're really stressed about this college stuff, huh?" Richard asked, leaning back into the couch. Chloe sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. "It's more than that. It's everything. Mom. School. Expectations. Sometimes it feels like I can't breathe. Richard studied her, his eyes softening. Your mom only wants what's best for you, Chloe. But I get it. She can be intense. That made Chloe laugh, a bitter, half-choked sound. Yeah, intense is one way to put it. The conversation shifted, grew deeper, as Chloe began sharing frustrations she had never dared to voice. Richard listened intently, nodding, occasionally offering words of reassurance. For the first time, Chloe felt seen, not as the overachieving daughter, not as the polished reflection of her mother's ambitions, but as herself. And then, somewhere in the midst of shared vulnerabilities, Chloe said something she couldn't take back. You know, she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper, sometimes I think, you're the only one who really gets me. Richard froze, his glass hovering mid-air. Chloe, he said cautiously, you know I care about you. More than you probably realize. The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, a silent acknowledgement of something they had both felt but neither dared to name. Until now. Chloe wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was her, emboldened by the wine and the charged atmosphere. Or maybe it was Richard, his judgment clouded by the emotions he had suppressed for months. All she knew was that one moment, they were sitting side by side, and the next, the space between them had disappeared. His hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that could have been innocent. But it wasn't. Chloe didn't pull away, and neither did he. I don't think this is right, Richard murmured, but his words lacked conviction. Then why does it feel like it is? Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. In that instant, the boundaries they had danced around for months crumbled. Their inhibitions drowned in the storm raging outside. The kiss that followed was hesitant at first, a tentative crossing of a forbidden line. But it quickly deepened, years of suppressed emotions igniting in a single, reckless moment. When Chloe woke up the next morning, the gravity of what had happened hit her like a tidal wave. The living room, bathed in soft morning light, felt foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. She sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, as the memories of the night before played on an endless loop in her mind. Richard entered the room, coffee in hand, his expression a mixture of guilt and resolve. We can't let this happen again, he said firmly. But even as he spoke, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them that the damage was already done. Chloe nodded, her throat dry. It was just a mistake. We were both lonely. Exactly, Richard agreed, though the words sounded hollow. We moved past it. Pretend it never happened. But as the days turned into weeks, pretending became impossible. The kiss had shattered something between them, but it had also awakened something neither could ignore. What followed was a dangerous game of stolen glances and whispered conversations. Richard found excuses to be home earlier, lingering in the kitchen while Chloe worked on her homework. Chloe, for her part, sought out his company under the guise of needing help with college applications or career advice. They told themselves they were keeping it under control, that their connection was nothing more than a fleeting lapse in judgment. But every secret text, every accidental touch, only drew them deeper into a web of deceit. At family dinners, Sophie began to notice the strange tension in the room. Richard and Chloe, once distant, now seemed unusually attuned to each other. Their conversations were lively, filled with inside jokes that excluded her. If she entered a room, their discussions would abruptly halt, their shared laughter replaced by an awkward silence. Richard's internal rationalizations grew more elaborate. Chloe wasn't his biological daughter, he reminded himself. She was an adult, legally speaking. And Sophie had been cold and distant for years. This isn't wrong, he told himself late at night, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. It's complicated, but it's not wrong. For Chloe, the feelings were more tangled. She felt exhilaration, guilt, and confusion all at once. She knew what they were doing was wrong, her mother's trust, her own innocence, all of it was at stake. But Richard made her feel special, desired in a way she hadn't experienced before. That feeling was addictive. What neither of them realized was that their actions were setting the stage for a disaster far greater than they could have imagined. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. By April 2023, Sophie Manning could no longer ignore the feeling gnawing at her from the inside, a quiet, insistent voice telling her that something was wrong. The changes in her home were too stark to dismiss as coincidence. Richard, who had spent years emotionally distant, now seemed overly attentive toward Chloe. Chloe, once an open book, had grown secretive, spending more time in her room or out of the house without explanation. There was something unspoken between them, an energy that didn't belong in the relationships she had worked so hard to build. At first, Sophie attributed her unease to stress. With Chloe's high school graduation around the corner and the constant demands of her social commitments, she told herself she was overthinking things. But then, the signs became harder to ignore. Richard began finding excuses to be home when Chloe was there. If she mentioned a project or needed advice, he would leap at the opportunity to help, often lingering longer than necessary. Sophie would catch them sitting too close on the couch, their heads bent together over Chloe's laptop, their laughter echoing through the house in a way that excluded her. During dinner, their conversations were filled with inside jokes, leaving Sophie feeling like an outsider in her own family. One evening, when Sophie tried to join in, both Richard and Chloe exchanged a quick, uncomfortable glance before abruptly changing the subject. It was a small moment, but it left Sophie cold. There were other, subtler clues. The way Richard's eyes lingered on Chloe just a beat too long. The way Chloe dressed more carefully, her hair styled and makeup applied, even when there was no occasion. Sophie began to piece these moments together, each one adding weight to her growing suspicion. Sophie wasn't the only one who noticed. During a lunch with Bianca Warner, her sharp-tongued but well-meaning friend from the neighborhood HOA, Bianca made an offhand comment that sent a chill through Sophie. "I saw Richard and Chloe at the cafe downtown last week," Bianca said, swirling her iced tea. "They looked so deep in conversation, I didn't want to interrupt. It's sweet how close they've gotten, don't you think?" Sophie's stomach dropped. "You saw them at a cafe?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Bianca nodded, oblivious to Sophie's unease. "Oh, yes. It was in the middle of the day. I thought Chloe was at school and Richard at work, but I guess they had some free time. You know how he dotes on her." Sophie forced a laugh, but her mind was racing. Why would Richard and Chloe be meeting in secret? And why hadn't either of them mentioned it? That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. Bianca's comment replayed in her mind over and over, mingling with the mounting list of oddities she had been trying to ignore. She wanted to confront Richard, but every time she opened her mouth, fear paralyzed her. What if she was wrong? What if she wasn't? Sophie decided to stop waiting for answers and find them herself. Late one night, while Richard was in the shower, she opened his laptop and began searching. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but the faint hope that she might be proven wrong was the only thing keeping her steady. At first, there was nothing. Emails, work files, everything looked normal. But then she opened his calendar and saw it, a recurring event labeled business lunch, at the same time Bianca had mentioned seeing Richard and Chloe at the cafe. Her breath quickened. Sophie's next discovery came from Richard's credit card statements, which she had access to for managing household expenses. Buried among the usual charges for gas and groceries were payments to a motel in Spartanburg. Not once, but several times over the past few months. Sophie stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The dots began to connect, forming a picture she couldn't bring herself to fully accept. Meanwhile, Chloe's behavior became harder to ignore. She began spending weekends at home more often, under the pretense of needing to catch up on schoolwork. But Sophie noticed the way she would leave suddenly, returning hours later with flimsy explanations. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side. And when Sophie asked what was going on, Chloe's responses were short, defensive, her usual openness replaced with an air of secrecy. One evening, Sophie overheard Chloe on the phone, her voice low and urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, intimate, almost conspiratorial. Sophie's chest tightened as she realized her daughter was no longer confiding in her, but in someone else. Desperate for clarity, Sophie downloaded a tracking app on Richard's phone, a decision that felt both invasive and necessary. She told herself it was the only way to quiet the storm of doubt raging inside her. For weeks, she watched his movements, hoping for reassurance but finding none. His patterns were erratic, with frequent trips to Spartanburg and unexplained stops that didn't match his supposed schedule. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon in early June. Sophie checked the app and saw that Richard was once again at the same motel in Spartanburg. Her heart sank as she stared at the screen, the pulsing dot confirming her worst fears. Then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife, another dot appeared, Chloe's phone, in the same location. Sophie's world tilted as the realization hit her. The suspicions she had fought so hard to suppress had materialized into an undeniable truth. She grabbed her keys, her hands trembling with fury and dread, and drove toward Spartanburg, knowing that whatever lay behind that motel door would change everything. The storm inside her had reached its crescendo, and Sophie was about to confront a truth more devastating than she could have ever imagined. The rain was relentless as Sophie Manning parked her car in the lot of the small motel on the outskirts of Spartanburg. The rhythmic patter against her windshield was deafening, a chaotic drumbeat mirroring the turmoil inside her. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the two familiar vehicles, Richard's sleek black sedan and Chloe's battered Honda. They were parked side by side, the sight of them together a cruel confirmation of the suspicions that had been eating away at her. She sat frozen for what felt like hours but was only minutes. Her hand trembled on the door handle, torn between confronting the truth and preserving the fragile illusion of her family. The laughter that had spilled from that motel door weeks ago still haunted her. This time, there would be no escaping the truth. Finally, propelled by a mix of fury and desperation, Sophie stepped out of the car. The cold rain soaked through her clothes as she approached the room. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement, the sound sharp and accusing in the stillness of the night. Sophie raised her fist and knocked, her knuckles hitting the wood harder than she intended. Her voice, strained and trembling, broke through the rain. "Richard? Chloe?" For a moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. Then, she heard hurried whispers, the rustle of movement inside. Her fury boiled over. She pounded on the door again, harder this time, her voice rising. "Open the door, Richard. I know you're in there." The door creaked open a crack, revealing Richard's face, disheveled, panicked, and utterly unprepared for the storm standing in front of him. Behind him, Sophie caught a glimpse of Chloe, her daughter's wide eyes filled with guilt and fear. Her heart clenched painfully at the sight. "What the hell is going on here?" Sophie demanded, pushing past Richard into the room. The air inside was thick with tension and the faint scent of cheap motel soap. Richard tried to intercept her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sophie, please, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. She turned to Chloe, who stood frozen near the bed, her cheeks flushed and tears brimming in her eyes. "Chloe, look at me. What are you doing here? What is this?" Chloe's lips quivered as she struggled for words, but Richard cut in, his tone urgent. "Sophie, we can explain." "Explain?" Sophie's voice rose, raw and filled with years of betrayal. "Explain how my husband and my daughter are meeting in a goddamn motel room? What kind of explanation could there possibly be for this?" Richard stepped forward, his face pale, his hands trembling. "It's not Chloe's fault. It's me. Don't you dare," Sophie hissed, her voice dripping with venom. She turned her fury toward him, her fists clenched at her sides. "Don't you dare try to protect her when you're the one who, the words failed her, choked by the raw betrayal clawing at her throat. The room descended into chaos. Years of pent-up resentment and lies spilled out as Sophie hurled accusations at Richard. She accused him of grooming Chloe, of betraying not just her as a wife but as a mother. Her voice cracked as she screamed at Chloe, her pain evident in every word. How could you do this to me? To us?" Chloe sobbed, trying to explain, trying to apologize, but the words were lost in the cacophony. "Mom, I didn't mean for this to happen, I didn't." Richard, desperate to calm the situation, tried to grab Sophie's arm. "Sophie, stop. You're not thinking straight. Don't touch me." Sophie snapped, wrenching her arm away. Her eyes burned with fury and heartbreak as she turned to Chloe, shaking her head. "You're my daughter. My little girl. And you," her voice cracked. "You let this happen." The atmosphere was suffocating, the air charged with emotions too volatile to contain. And then, Sophie's gaze shifted to the bedside table. Her breath caught as she saw it, Richard's gun. Richard followed her gaze, his eyes widening in alarm. "Sophie," he said carefully, stepping toward the table. "It's not what you think. Just, calm down." But Sophie's instincts screamed at her that he wasn't reaching for calm, he was reaching for control. She lunged toward the table, determined to grab the weapon before he could. "No!" Chloe cried, moving toward them in a panic, her arms outstretched as if to stop them both. What happened next was a blur. Richard's hand closed around the gun at the same moment Sophie reached for it. The scuffle was brief but violent, a chaotic tangle of desperation and fear. Chloe screamed, trying to pull them apart. And then, the gun went off. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that silenced the room and echoed through Sophie's skull. For a moment, everything froze. Then Sophie saw Chloe stagger backward, her hands clutching her stomach, her eyes wide with shock. A crimson stain spread across her shirt. "Chloe!" Sophie screamed, rushing to her daughter as she crumpled to the floor. She pressed her hands against the wound, her fingers slick with blood, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. "No, no, no, stay with me, baby. Stay with me." Richard stood frozen, the gun slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. His face was ashen, his eyes vacant. "I didn't mean to, I didn't," he stammered, but his words were meaningless, lost in Sophie's frantic pleas. The room descended into chaos once more, but this time it was the chaos of desperation. Sophie screamed for help, her voice hoarse and raw, as blood pooled beneath Chloe. Richard sank to his knees, his hands shaking as he muttered incoherent apologies. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as flashing lights filled the motel parking lot. Sophie barely registered the arrival of the police and paramedics. Her focus remained on Chloe, whose face was pale, her breaths shallow. As officers stormed into the room, the scene they found was one of devastation, a mother covered in her daughter's blood, a father sitting in stunned silence, and a young woman fighting for her life. The fragile illusion of the Manning family had finally shattered, leaving behind nothing but ruin. The hum of fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital's emergency room. Sophie Manning sat in a stiff plastic chair, her hands stained with dried blood that wasn't hers. Her daughter's blood. The chaos of the motel scene was a blur, flashing lights, shouted commands, and the overwhelming dread that gripped her as paramedics wheeled Chloe into the ambulance. She had ridden alongside her, clutching her daughter's hand as if sheer will could keep her tethered to life. Now, hours later, Sophie stared at the double doors of the operating room, her heart pounding every time they swung open. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Somewhere, in another part of the hospital, Richard was being questioned by police. The thought of him, his face pale, his hands trembling, his useless apologies, filled her with a fury so intense it felt like it might consume her. But it was drowned out by something greater, fear. Fear for Chloe, for the girl who had once been her entire world, now teetering on the brink of survival. The events at the motel had unfolded in a frenzy of confusion and devastation. Within minutes of the gunshot, the parking lot was bathed in the strobing red and blue of police lights. Officers swarmed the room, finding Sophie kneeling on the floor, pressing her hands desperately against Chloe's wound. Blood had soaked through her blouse, pooling on the cheap carpet beneath them. Richard sat slumped in the corner, his face ashen, the gun discarded on the floor where it had fallen from his grip. He made no move to flee, no protest as the officers cuffed him and led him out of the room. His vacant stare was that of a man who had just realized the magnitude of his actions but lacked the words, or the courage, to face them. Detective Lucas Dempsey had arrived shortly after the first responders, his seasoned eyes taking in the scene with a grim understanding. The story that unfolded in his preliminary interviews was one of betrayal, forbidden desire, and shattered trust. But the truth of what had led to the shooting was murky, tangled in the raw emotions of those involved. As Chloe fought for her life in the operating room, Detective Dempsey began piecing together the fragments of what had happened. Sophie's initial statements were disjointed, her voice trembling with shock and rage. She described the confrontation in the motel room, the accusations, and the scuffle over the gun. Her account painted a picture of desperation. Her attempt to stop Richard from harming her daughter spiraled into an unthinkable tragedy. Richard's story was equally fractured. In the interrogation room, he insisted that the shooting was an accident, the result of a chaotic struggle for the gun. "I never meant for this to happen," he repeated over and over, his voice hoarse. But when pressed about his relationship with Chloe, his answers grew evasive. The shame in his eyes spoke volumes even as he tried to rationalize his actions. Dempsey's suspicions were confirmed when officers began uncovering the digital trail of the illicit affair. Text messages exchanged between Richard and Chloe painted a damning picture: long, late-night conversations, affectionate nicknames, and explicit plans to meet in secret. Hotel receipts and credit card statements corroborated Sophie's claims of deception. Friends and neighbors who had once admired the Mannings as the epitome of suburban perfection now whispered in disbelief as the scandal unraveled. Meanwhile, Chloe's condition remained critical. The gunshot had torn through her abdomen, causing significant internal damage. The surgeons worked tirelessly to stabilize her, but the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Sophie sat vigil in the waiting room, refusing to leave even as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. Every passing hour without news felt like another weight pressing down on her chest. When a doctor finally emerged from the operating room, Sophie bolted to her feet. "She's alive," the doctor said, his tone cautious. "But the next 48 hours will be critical. She's not out of danger yet." Relief flooded Sophie's body, but it was fleeting. The knowledge that Chloe had survived the surgery brought with it a new wave of questions. What would happen to her daughter now? How would she face the emotional scars of what had happened, of what she and Richard had done? News of the shooting spread quickly, plunging the quiet suburban neighborhood of Greenville into shock. The Mannings, once admired as a model family, became the center of scandal and gossip. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, struggling to reconcile the image of the poised and elegant Sophie with the chaos that had unfolded. Bianca Warner, Sophie's closest friend in the HOA, was among the first to visit her at the hospital. She sat beside Sophie, clutching her hand tightly. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I had no idea about any of it." Sophie barely nodded, her mind too consumed by the weight of everything that had happened. The perfect life she had worked so hard to maintain was gone, replaced by a storm of betrayal, scandal, and regret. In the days that followed, Detective Dempsey continued his investigation, meticulously combing through the evidence. Interviews with Chloe's friends revealed the extent of the manipulation Richard had exerted over her, while financial records and hotel bookings left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. As the pieces came together, it became clear that the shooting was not just an accident but the culmination of months of deceit and broken trust. Richard was charged with multiple offenses, including aggravated assault and unlawful conduct with a minor. Sophie, though initially questioned as a potential suspect, was ultimately released after evidence supported her claims of self-defense and an accidental discharge of the weapon during the struggle. Back at the hospital, Sophie remained by Chloe's side, watching over her as the machines beeped softly in the background. Chloe's face was pale, her breathing shallow, but she was alive. That was all that mattered to Sophie now. As she sat in the sterile room, the enormity of what had happened began to sink in. The family she had worked so hard to build was gone, shattered beyond repair. But for Chloe's sake, for the daughter she had vowed to protect, Sophie knew she had to find a way to move forward, no matter how impossible it seemed. The fallout was only beginning, and the path ahead would be fraught with pain and uncertainty. But Sophie clung to a fragile hope that, somehow, she and Chloe could rebuild from the ruins of their lives. The storm that had torn them apart might never fully abate, but perhaps, in time, they could learn to live in its aftermath. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that magnifies every creak of a chair, every rustle of papers. Sophie Manning sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across the room, Richard sat hunched over, his once imposing frame diminished in the orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shoulders. His eyes avoided Sophie's, they avoided everyone's. This was a man unrecognizable from the confident, charismatic figure he had once been. The trial of Richard Manning, now infamous in Greenville and far beyond, had become a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, journalists, and neighbors who had once celebrated the Mannings as the epitome of suburban success. Now, they sat in stunned disbelief, eager to witness the unraveling of the man they had once admired. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Elaine Monroe, built a damning case against Richard. They meticulously laid out the timeline of his relationship with Chloe, presenting evidence of his manipulation and deceit. Text messages between him and Chloe were displayed on a large screen for the jury to see, each one more incriminating than the last. Messages that started innocuously enough, discussions about college and life advice, had spiraled into confessions of love and explicit plans to meet in secret. Richard Manning abused his position of trust, Monroe declared during her opening statement, her voice firm but controlled. He preyed on a vulnerable young woman under the guise of fatherly care, and when his actions threatened to come to light, his reckless behavior culminated in a tragedy that nearly cost her life. Hotel receipts, financial records, and witness testimony painted a clear picture of the affair. Chloe's college roommate, Zara, testified about the frequent visits Richard had made to campus under the pretense of business trips. He wasn't there for work, Zara said, her voice trembling. He was there for Chloe. When Sophie took the stand, the room held its breath. Her voice was steady, though tinged with the weight of everything she had endured. She recounted the months of suspicion, the moment she confronted Richard and Chloe at the motel, and the chaotic struggle that led to the gunshot. He betrayed me as a wife, she said, her voice breaking, but worse than that, he betrayed my daughter. He took advantage of her trust, of her need for validation, and he turned it into something vile. The courtroom remained silent as Sophie described the anguish of seeing Chloe lying on the motel floor, bleeding and terrified. Her words cut through the room like a blade, leaving no doubt about the devastation Richard's actions had wrought. Richard's defense, led by high-powered attorney Xavier Brockton, painted a different narrative. They framed the affair as a consensual relationship between two adults, arguing that while it was inappropriate, it was not criminal. They claimed the gunshot was a tragic accident, the result of an emotionally charged moment spiraling out of control. Richard Manning made poor choices, Brockton conceded during his closing argument, but he is not a predator. He is a man who let his emotions cloud his judgment, and he has already lost everything. But the jury remained unconvinced. The sheer volume of evidence, the messages, the receipts, the testimonies, painted a picture of manipulation and exploitation that couldn't be explained away. After 2 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached its decision. On a humid July afternoon, the verdict was read, guilty of aggravated assault and unlawful conduct with a minor. Richard sat motionless as the words were spoken, his face a mask of resignation. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a punishment that felt simultaneously too lenient and unbearably harsh, depending on who you asked. As he was led away in handcuffs, Richard turned to Sophie one last time. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, an unspoken exchange passed between them, regret, anger, sadness, and the acknowledgement of everything they had lost. Chloe, still recovering from her injuries, chose not to testify during the trial. Invoking her Fifth Amendment rights, she avoided the courtroom altogether, spending her days in therapy instead. The physical wounds were healing, but the emotional scars ran deep. The media frenzy surrounding the trial only compounded her struggle. Whispers followed her everywhere, from her college dorm to the grocery store. Chloe withdrew from her social circles, retreating into herself as she grappled with the reality of her choices and the damage they had caused. In the aftermath of the trial, Sophie sold the family home in Greenville. The once pristine house, with its manicured lawn and picture-perfect facade, had become a haunting reminder of the life she thought she had built. She moved to a quieter town, seeking anonymity and a fresh start. Her relationship with Chloe remained strained. The betrayal had created a chasm between them, one that neither knew how to bridge. But Sophie was determined to try. She began attending therapy herself, learning to navigate the tangled emotions of grief, anger, and guilt. In prison, Richard faded into obscurity. The once successful businessman, who had commanded rooms with his charisma, now spent his days in quiet reflection. He wrote letters to Chloe and Sophie, none of which were answered. They sat unopened in Sophie's new home, a reminder of the man who had destroyed their family. The Manning case faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered. In Greenville, it became a whispered cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect families can harbor dark secrets. Community leaders initiated programs aimed at preventing domestic manipulation and fostering healthy relationships, using the Manning story as a stark example of what could happen when trust was betrayed. For Sophie and Chloe, the road ahead remained uncertain. But as they navigated the aftermath, both clung to the hope that, in time, they could rebuild, not the life they had before, but something new. Something honest. Something that could survive the weight of the truth. The summer sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood Sophie Manning now called home. The house was modest compared to the sprawling suburban estate she had left behind in Greenville, but it was peaceful. No curious neighbors, no lingering stares, no whispers behind her back. It was exactly what she needed. Sophie stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the backyard where Chloe sat on a swing, gently swaying back and forth. It had been months since the trial, months since their lives had unraveled so violently, and yet the weight of it all still lingered. Chloe's physical wounds had healed, but the emotional ones remained raw, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Sophie's relationship with her daughter was fragile, like a cracked vase held together by sheer will. They spoke, but not deeply. They shared space, but not connection. Sophie wanted to reach out, to hold Chloe and tell her it wasn't her fault, that they could move past this together. But every time she tried, the words caught in her throat. How do you heal from a betrayal so profound? How do you rebuild trust when the foundations have been shattered? Chloe, for her part, was trying. Therapy sessions filled her weeks, and while she often came home exhausted and tearful, Sophie noticed small changes. Chloe had begun sketching again, her once-abandoned art supplies scattered across the dining table. Sophie took it as a sign, a small step toward rediscovering the parts of herself that had been buried under shame and guilt. One evening, as they sat in silence over dinner, Chloe spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm thinking of going back to school." Sophie looked up, surprised but hopeful. "That's wonderful, Chloe." "Really?" "It won't be easy," Chloe continued, her eyes fixed on her plate. "But I think I need to try. I can't let this define me." Sophie reached across the table, placing her hand over Chloe's. "You're stronger than you know, Chloe. And no matter what, I'm here for you." It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. For the first time in months, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. For Sophie, the events of the past year had been a brutal awakening. She had spent years building a life based on appearances, ignoring the cracks that had formed beneath the surface. The betrayal by Richard and Chloe had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about them, but about herself. She had clung too tightly to control, too focused on creating a perfect image of a family that had never truly existed. Now, Sophie was learning to let go. She was learning that healing wasn't linear, that forgiveness didn't come all at once, and that sometimes, it was okay to not have all the answers. As for Richard, Sophie had not spoken to him since the trial. His letters remained unopened, tucked away in a drawer she rarely opened. She didn't know if she would ever be ready to face him again. Perhaps one day, but not now. For now, her focus was on Chloe, on herself, and on the fragile but undeniable possibility of a future. Sophie watched as Chloe stood from the swing and began walking toward the house, the golden light of the setting sun framing her figure. She saw not the mistakes Chloe had made or the pain they had caused, but the resilience in her daughter's steps. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie believed they could walk it together. The storm had passed, but its scars remained, a reminder of the fragility of trust, the complexity of love, and the strength it took to rebuild from ruin. Sophie and Chloe were not the same people they had been, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. What do you think of Sophie and Chloe's journey? Could their relationship ever fully heal after such a devastating betrayal? How would you handle a situation like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspectives on this complex and emotional story. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories like this one. Your support helps us bring more stories to light.